Let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. When you read, you begin with A, B, C. When you politic, you begin with power. Today, we continue the series on politics and power in fantasy world building, with understanding the essence of the role of government within the context of a fantasy world. We'll take a look at the history of governments in our world, the role they have played here, and what role they would play in your world, with special emphasis on how magic and other fantastical elements will influence governments. Welcome back to Just in Time World series on politics in fantasy, with your host, Marie Mullaney. Let's start with what politics are. Very briefly, whenever you have more than two people, you will inevitably have politics, as people's opinion clash, and the two clashing individuals try and convince the third person to enter the argument on their side, and that is politics. And that is why politics is dependent on bargaining power. The bargaining power of the two people with the third person to come into the argument on their side is what determines the victor of that argument. And when you are talking about groups, you talk about the collective bargaining power of men versus women, of tribes versus each other, of young versus old, of whatever your identifying group is. Politics happens in every social situation ever, but in terms of a government, politics defines who gets to decide about things that influence the whole society for a given society. Now, bear in mind, you don't have to have a government. There are societies in which you have no government at all, and I promise you, the episode on anarchy in fantasy is coming. But for the most part, if you have a sedentary society where people live together in a fixed location, or a society where people have assets like livestock, you probably have a government. Simply put, those governments grew out of the need to defend either that location or those herds of animals, which is why government really rose to prominence with the advent of agriculture. And that segues us nicely into government's evolution through time. In the days before bread, back when we still roamed the earth in hunter-gatherer bands, our governments were minimal to non-existent. Early human societies were organized around kinship and tribal affiliations, with leadership roles often based on family ties or personal prowess. Decision-making was communal, with a focus on the survival and well-being of the tribe. We can see this in action in the behavior of the Sand people, who have temporary leaders for certain activities, like they will have a leader of the hunt to make sure decisions can be taken quickly. But they have no tribal leader of the whole group. Instead, decisions are taken jointly by all those affected by the decision. Agriculture changed all that for a number of reasons. Yes, my books have now been replaced by a cat. I hope that you all appreciate her presence. Her name is Asura, and she loves you, and she loves me, and she loves all the things, especially when I'm filming. Where were we? Agriculture changed all that. That is just typical. Imagine the books behind me. Agriculture changed all that for a number of reasons. The development of agriculture led to settled communities requiring new forms of governance to manage resources like land and water, and very importantly, defense. Before, with hunter-gatherer bands, if you had beef with another tribe, you could just move. But with agriculture, you invest in property, be it livestock or land. And if you don't defend your investment, you lose it. Along with that loss goes your survival. This is also one of the contributing factors to the patriarchy in our world. See, it goes like this. Men related to each other by blood make a better fighting force because they can work together more easily. So, for the sake of defense, most cultures adopted the marriage culture of patrolocality, which is to say, the woman moved away from her family to her husband's family. And because of this, if it came to a dispute between a man and a woman in a he said, she said situation, the man had the support of his family and the woman had very limited support, having moved away from her family. And so women's bargaining power declined vis-a-vis the bargaining power of men. And that's why bargaining power, again, is important. And that is the first thing to consider in the evolution of your world. If you have magic, this rise of patrolocality, of women moving to the men's village, might never happen. If women, being able to leverage magic, can make equally as effective a fighting force as men, because you remove the 15% sexual dimorphism, you might never have a patriarchal rise. And this doesn't mean you must have a matriarchal rise either. The society could just remain egalitarian, with the status of the individual determined independently of their sex or gender. And this is definitely something to think about when you're constructing your world, even if you are thousands of years removed from the agricultural revolution. What happened at this point with defense of the agricultural assets? And how does that affect the government structures of your world today? This was where government was born. How it was influenced in that moment is very important for where it is now. I did make 2 videos relevant to this. World Building for Prehistory, which is part of the Eras Defined playlist, and Magic in Prehistory, which is a standalone and deals specifically with magic. Okay, so that's the initial rise of government. But what happened afterward? Well, early civilizations such as Egypt and Mesopotamia, which developed intricate bureaucracies to oversee agriculture, production, taxation, and defense. As communities grew into city-states and later empires, governance structures became more complex. This period is marked by the development of legal codes, standing armies, and administrative systems to manage diverse populations and expansive territories. And I covered a lot of this ground in the Neolithic and Bronze Age videos, which you can check out in the Eras Defined playlist. In those videos, there's also specific advice on how to integrate magic and fantasy into those eras and governments. Then from the Bronze Age of Empire, we flow through the classical period with more empire. It always comes down to empire. And then the empire falls. In many parts of the world, the collapse of empires led to feudal systems, where local lords governed in exchange for military services to a higher monarch. This is your strongest rise of classes and caste, and your most direct tie back to defense for government. There is chaos all around you, and a man on a horse with a sword says, "Give me food and I'll give you safety. And if you don't give me food, I'll burn your farm down." And I'll let you guess what you do at that point. This era emphasized hierarchical relationships and land-based power. But eventually, it does give way to the modern era, which saw the rise of the nation-state characterized by centralized government with sovereignty over defined territories. And this period is defined by the development of representative democracies, legal rights, and the welfare state. If you want to build a well-integrated fantasy world, consider each of these eras and how magic changes everything. Remember that the earlier you insert magic, the more it will affect changes. Like if people learn magic instead of science in the Renaissance equivalent era, not much changes. But if they come out of the box with magic, back in prehistory times, a lot changes. And if you enjoyed this sojourn into the evolution of government, hit the thumbs up button. And let's plunge into what we learn from this about government's core functions. There are three main points to make about government's core function as I see it. 1. Security and defense. From the earliest settlements to modern nations, one of the primary roles of government has been to protect society. This includes not only defense against external threats, but also the maintenance of internal order through policing and law enforcement, especially the enforcement of property rights once we conceived of the notion of owning assets that provide a living, like land or livestock. 2. Adjudication of disputes. Another consistent function of government is the resolution of disputes among citizens. This actually exists before agriculture. It begins with tribal elders or councils, or even all the members of a tribe mediating conflicts. And again, this is where bargaining power of groups plays so very big of a role. Now, this kind of adjudication was at first basically just who does the community believe in a he said, she said, or he said situation. But it very rapidly evolved into complex legal systems with codified laws and judiciary branches, starting with the legal code of Hammurabi back in the Bronze Age. 3. Management of collective resources. Early agricultural societies required centralized management of resources like water for irrigation. Over time, this expanded to include public infrastructure, education, and welfare services. The government's role in managing collective resources is still pretty crucial. Think in terms of bridges, roads, power grids, and shared infrastructure like that. So if we distill these 3 points down, I would say the main function of any government is to provide security, to maintain order, and to facilitate the management of collective resources. And remember that in point number 2, property rights are paramount. At the very least, that's what a government needs to do in order to be successful, in my opinion. But what does that mean for a fantasy world? Let me know what you think about these government functions in the comments below, and let's turn our attention to magic and mystery and politics. Let's start with magic, which can serve both as a powerful tool for public good and a significant threat. For example, magic could be used to enhance agricultural yields, heal citizens, or improve transportation. Conversely, it could also be weaponized and used to enforce authoritarian rule. Because of this, you need to decide how your government interacts with magic. This was the topic of one of my channel's early videos, which you can check out in the information card. But briefly, consider how laws might be structured around the use of magic, who is permitted to wield it, and the penalties for misuse of magic. This could parallel regulations of weaponry in and advanced technology in our world. But also consider, if you don't regulate magic, what happens? Are all of your mages actually also kings? Remember, magic disrupts the bargaining power of groups. It gives individuals with magic a massive advantage. How does that advantage play out, and how is it regulated if it is regulated in your world? If it's not regulated, you might well be in a magocracy, which I have made not one, but two videos about, which you can check out in the information cards. So that's the threat side of magic and why it should be regulated. But what about the benefits magic could bring to a government if it is regulated or used well? Imagine scenarios where magic replaces traditional public services. For instance, spells or magical constructs could handle waste management. Spells could be used for healing instead of traditional medicine. Or magical barriers could replace physical ones for defense. Your army could be irrelevant, replaced by a mage who creates wards. Consider those core roles of governments we just discussed: defense, order, and collective resources. What is the impact of magic in each of those areas? Let me know in the comments how you think your magic system will affect the core roles of your government. But fantasy is more than just magic. So let's talk about governance and non-human entities. Non-human races such as elves, dwarves, or sentient AIs bring a unique perspective to governance. Their lifespans, abilities, and moral philosophies could influence laws and policies in ways that are vastly different from human governance. Consider the undead if they're legal citizens. What happens to inheritance laws? This was one of the very interesting elements of the early Anita Blake books by Laurel K. Hamilton. In these books, vampires were suddenly declared legal citizens in the United States, and there was a whole plethora of laws that went really weird, as you had a legal system that had to deal with ageless people who were suddenly back from the dead, baby. Also, in a modern government, your dragons might demand representation. Your elves could insist on being tried by a jury of their peers, meaning people who understand their long lifespan and can also understand the pressure that puts them under. Ask yourselves questions like, how does a government tax a dragon? Or what are the logistics of a treasury guarded by creatures with inherent magical abilities? Or how do you jail and feed a vampire? Or is it legal defense for a were creature to claim temporary insanity during the full moon? Law enforcement is really important to consider here. How do you police your mages, your telepaths, your fantastical creatures? Can a ghost bring a magical memory to show its murder to court? Would this be considered evidence? These kinds of questions explore the practicalities of managing resources, wealth, and law enforcement in a world where fantastical creatures exist. So, what does all this mean for your political structures in your world? Let's put magic and fantasy together and discuss fantasy governments as a whole. First, you must consider social stratification. Magic and fantasy creatures both could lead to new forms of social stratification. Mages might form an elite class, or certain races might be favored over others due to their inherent magical abilities or longevity. This will impact the bargaining power of all groups and will thus influence your government. Second, this kind of stratification could very easily lead to revolution, rebellion, or reform. Oppressed groups might use magic to challenge existing power structures, or they might develop technology and thus democratize power and spark a revolution. The Powder Mage trilogy from Brian McClellan does a great job of exploring some of these aspects with actual sorcerers gathered in royal cabals. And one of the things that has to happen for the revolution led by Tamas to succeed is the destruction of those sorcerers, which he achieves through the Powder Mages, who are somewhat lesser, but still powerful mages who also use the technology of muskets. But maybe none of these storylines of rebellion, revolution, and social change appeal to you, and you're looking to build a cozier world. Nothing wrong with that. And in that case, just consider those roles that government plays and how your fantasy elements interact with those roles and how they change the evolution of your government through your world's history. And those are my thoughts on governments and fantasy. If you want to see how I implemented governments and fantasy and so on, you can check out my epic fantasy books down below, the Sangwheel Chronicles that my cat so rudely threw off the table. However, please don't feel pressured to support the channel financially. You can also show your support just by watching another video. Since you enjoyed this one, maybe check out my video on government types as the iceberg meme. Or you could trust the algorithm with its recommendation over there. And I will see you soon for another episode from Just in Time Worlds, where we build what we need when we need it.